to start. Thank you, Elena. Thanks to you all for being here for this last session of both thought-provoking and inspiring and tiring conference. we've just had lunch. I hope you're not too tired, or if you are, I hope I'll find the energy to wake you up. So I'm going to talk about the history of birth attendants versus registered midwives, and I apologize for this really clumsy title. When Elena asked me to think of something that I could talk about, no good title came to my mind, so this is what I ended up with. But what I would like to do in this presentation is to reflect upon my previous research on childbirth, in which I included both qualified midwives. I will use the terms registered or qualified as synonyms, and what I called here birth attendants, or the actual acronym, promoted by the World Health Organization is TBAs for traditional birth attendants. Actually, it's one of the rare occasions where the French language is more adequate or more accurate than the English language, because in French I will talk about accoucheuse, which literally means deliverers or deliverer, which has nothing to do with somebody you call to deliver a pizza to your home place, but it's a man or a woman. Accoucheuse is the female version, but accoucheur also exists, who helps women deliver their own children. Anyway, for lack of such a word in English, and I really don't like the term matron, which also has an equivalent in French because of its really negative connotations. So it's a word that I never use myself, only when I quote, my own sources. So I will talk about birth attendants or TBAs. And I would like to reflect upon the relative focus on these two categories as they appear in my latest book, which I will talk about, and reflect upon the fact that I insisted more on the former than on the latter. I insisted on the qualified midwives and somehow left apart the birth attendants. So I'd like to see why I've done that, and also consider what I could do in the future to sort of counter this a problem of balance or imbalance between the two, in order, for example, to write an article which would fit nicely within the program of the ERC on urban birth assistance. So the research sorry, how do I do that? Oops. Sorry, Elena.
No. Actually, just click.
Okay.
And then it wakes up.
Okay. Thank you. So this is the book that I published 3 years ago, which only exists in French, at least so far. I'm hoping to have it published in English eventually. It's actually been translated by DeepL Pro, but I haven't found one single minute since last August to look at the quality of the translation, and obviously this would have to be read by a native speaker, which I'm not. So I tried again quite clumsily to translate the fourth page cover here from French into English, just to give you a sense of what I tried to do in that book. So among other things, in that book, I analyzed the birth and the rise of a new body of professional women in the Gold Coast, qualified midwives. I was interested in how they were recruited, how they were trained, under what circumstances they worked, the kind of professional identity and work ethos they developed, and how also they combine their work with other aspects of their lives.
Just 30 seconds, excuse me,
No
because
problem.
I need to put Domenico as a, voilà,
Okay.
as a co-host. Is the one?
That's the,
And that's the,
yeah, that's where I'm at. Okay,
yeah, and,
great.
up.
Thank you. So out of 9 chapters, 2 were entirely dedicated to these qualified midwives. So that gives you an idea of how much I was interested in them. And no chapter was dedicated to birth attendants. So that says something of my bias, upon which I didn't really take an opportunity to reflect upon until this conference, happened. The qualified midwives were very few in the beginning of the colonial era, and they were all immigrants from either Britain or sometimes the Caribbean. By the eve of independence, which, as you may know, in Ghana was in 57, they numbered between 500 if you consider those who were actually working on the field, and 700 if you take all the midwives who had been trained and qualified from the beginning of their existence as qualified midwives. So sources to document their training and their lives were numerous and varied, both in Ghana and in Britain. So I relied on published material of the medical administration, of which you have an example here, with the first edition of what is called the Roll of Midwives, or Midwives' Rolls. The first edition of it appeared in 1932, and it was a list of qualified midwives. What does it mean? It means that they were authorized to practice as such with the title midwife, and this was a list printed annually in the Gold Coast Gazette, which was the official publication of the government with official data of all kinds. And it was supposedly renewed annually and updated annually, but in fact it was not very accurate. Never mind. There were also, of course, unpublished correspondence and reports from the same administration. Here you have an example of a letter written by Cicely Williams, who was a lady medical officer in charge of a child and maternal welfare center in Kofredua, for example. And more often than not, they would also talk about midwives. You also have the press among the sources that we have discussed together in the past few days. Here's a picture from the Daily Graphic, which is the most common and prominent daily newspaper. Just after independence, on the 23rd of December 1958, and it celebrates the birth of 2 babies, one called Nkrumah and the other one called Fatia, which was Nkrumah's wife's name. And you see pupil midwife holding both of them. She actually worked in one of the private clinics whose owner I interviewed. So it was interesting to, again, cross-read these different sources. Of course, there's also oral sources. So for this project, I interviewed 30 retired midwives, or sometimes not retired. I remember an interview with a 84-year-old midwife in Tamale, for example. And when I got there for the interview, it was about 10 in the morning. This was the time we had, agreed on. I turned up and she said, I'm a bit tired because there was a delivery last night. And she was still running her own clinic. So anyway, she was a colonial midwife in the sense that she had been trained during colonial times. These interviews took place around 2000, 2001, 2002, 2003, more or less. So about 20 years ago. So this is just one example. I just chose, this excerpt from an interview with Comfort Brenya, whom I interviewed in Bubiashi in a district in Accra. And of course pictures. So some of them are printed pictures, such as this one, which was published in a pamphlet on nurses training, and it shows the maternity hospital, which was built in 1928. And sometimes unpublished pictures, such as this one, whom I found among the papers of a certain Dr. Goodman, who had run the maternity hospital for a number of years at the end of the 1940s and early 1950s. And this is to me, it was an important picture because it showed the very first batch of qualified midwives. So these young ladies are at the end of their training. They have been trained for 3 years at the maternity hospital, and now they have their own certificate, and they can go and work either in the public service or as private practitioners. Another source for pictures was, of course, the oral interviews which I conducted with midwives. Some of them were kind enough and they had enough material to share with me, such as pictures. So on this picture you see my informant, Mrs. Aikpa, sitting on her aunt's lap in 1925, and this shows the kind of typical background these midwives, the very first ones, were from. They were not all of them from that kind of elite background, but quite a lot of them were. Okay, so now this was a relatively easy task. All these sources were somehow, for somebody who works on Ghanaian history, classical sources, oral sources. We mentioned this, Emma mentioned this morning. Oral interviews have become, an average kind of source if you do African history. I never had the feeling that I was doing something really innovative or, Now, in spite of the fact that on the eve of independence, a majority of women in Ghana gave birth with the assistance of non-formally qualified midwives, I did not particularly, as I said, focus on these birth assistants. And I can try to assess the reasons for this, and this is both, if you want, an explanation, and in some ways also a self-criticism. So even though that's one reason, even though I owe a lot to anthropological literature, I did not dwell upon the topic of non-medicalized childbirth because, for a variety of reasons. One, the conditions in which birth is given in Ghanaian or Gold Coast societies around 1910, for example, vary quite a lot depending on the culture. And there was no end to the list that I should have done of, food taboos or the kind of rituals that went on with childbirth and so on and so forth. So because my aim was to cover the whole of what has become Ghana geographically, I just couldn't, even imagine making a list of the various birth rights and so on. The other thing is that, of course, even in non-medicalized environments, the conditions of childbirth evolve over time, like every aspect of social life. But anthropologists, as you know, rarely acknowledge this. And in a way, the kind of literature I had was, this is how things are done among, the Eves, the whatever, you name it. And I also had a problem with that. And then I didn't want to give an impression that I could precisely describe, let alone analyze, the conditions of birth with a traditional birth attendant. So because of the approach induced by the sources I mostly relied on and analyzed, which related to the medicalization of childbirth, TBAs were not central characters. My efforts clearly sought to document the changes over time that affected childbirth, not to document the perennity of the experience. That's the historian's bias, if I may say so. So even though I acknowledge the fact that traditional quote-unquote childbirth did not escape the change pattern, I did focus mostly on the conspicuously evolving patterns, and they did not include birth attendants. However, I did take them into account in the book, and I do know a few things about them, to the extent it came back to my mind that before I started writing, I had a database of all my documents, and I had a keyword for TBAs. So it showed that I did have an interest in them, even though not enough to devote a whole chapter to them. So if I was now to write a paper on urban birth assistance, how would I proceed? I guess I would start by building up on what I already know about birth attendants in order to answer a series of specific questions. To me, the most important ones, because that's the main question of this ERC program, were there still birth attendants in Ghanaian towns up to a certain point, and if so, up to when? Another way of putting it is, were they quite early on ousted from towns, or did they remain active in towns and not exclusively in rural environment? And then there's a sub-question to that, which is the category of town even relevant to this research in a way? So I just want to move to this map, which appears in the book, actually, and which shows the location of urban child welfare centers in 1933. And you see that they are all situated or located in the southern part of the country, the northernmost part being Kumasi, which is, in fact, for those who know Ghana, very close to the coast. And those were undisputably towns in the 1930s, even though we have been discussing what a town is, and I was very interested in what was said about pipe water versus electricity, for example, because I do have information about when electricity became available in such and such town, but no such thing for pipe water, so maybe I would have to look into that as well. Anyway, so if I want to build upon what I already know, I could go back to a source that I had not really neglected, because I do mention it in the first chapter of the book, but I think I could extract more information than what I've done. I could rely on an amazing document which consists in the interviews of 3 birth assistants in 1917. So what exactly is this document? It's part of a very thick document which bears the title Infant Mortality Committee 1915-1919, and which is kept at the National Archives in London. It contains about 100 pages, ranging from letters by a medical doctor to the governor urging the government to do something to counter high maternal and infant mortality rates. That's the first document chronologically. And it ends with a fairly thick report by the committee members who were appointed by the governor to try and understand and document the mortality among infants in Accra solely, because the figures were considered to be very high, and so they were looking for the reasons for such high rates of infant mortality and also maternal mortality. So 3 birth assistants were interviewed during the course of this inquiry, mostly by medical doctors, but also there was a sanitary engineer and a Gold Coast woman called Florence Hutton Mills, who had married a prominent lawyer and was the sister of a prominent doctor. So I just took pictures for today of 2 of these interviews. One is 3 pages interviews, the other one 5 pages, and then there's a third midwife, native midwife is what they were called at the time. And her interviews is a bit shorter. The other thing that we must bear in mind is the fact that colonial authorities were systematically negative, but really, really negative about these assistants. They were described as ignorant and, whether consciously or not, harmful to both women and children. So I have many quotations to support this assessment. The Governor Clifford, who writing to the Secretary of State at the Colonial Office in 1999, writes, "Such personal observations as I have been able to make during the past 6 years, however, incline me to the belief that the mortality among infants is greater and that much less skill is exercised by native midwives in the Gold Coast than in any part of the tropics," etc. He is supported by the principal medical officer, who also gives his opinion on the causes of infant mortality and comments on one of the native midwives' testimony. So I consider the evidence of the midwives to be the most valuable portion of this report, and there is no getting away from the illuminating picture it presents of ignorance, wrongful procedure, and superstition in the treatment of both mother and child. And then he goes further, then he gets really angry. Both angry and compassionate, and we can talk about this later if you want, but what is this other woman for? They're out for business and speedy delivery, these 2, and in view of all I have been told as to the violence resorted to on such occasions, my imagination turns from dwelling upon the agonies that must be endured by many a poor woman in her first confinement in this country. So this was the general diagnosis, and this is not something I will talk a lot about, but the 2 conclusions of this committee were that the midwives were responsible for maternal mortality and also for infant mortality, and the mothers were responsible for infant mortality. So it had nothing to do with, other factors such as socioeconomic or, the prevalence of malaria. It was mothers who were not good mothers. So based on this diagnosis, the colonial authorities decided to start training midwives, hence the number of documents that I have on qualified midwives. But interestingly, not to start training assistants or etc., but just to expel them from town or to forbid them from practicing. And this is quite clearly said in this letter to the Director of Medical Services. It says the midwives question I will explain to you the beginning of the sentence, is not parallel, as our object, and this is the important thing, is to replace in time in scheduled towns the native custom sari gamps by qualified and registered midwives, and ultimately to prohibit unqualified midwifery in these areas. So now you see why I'm thinking, I should try to ascertain whether this policy was ever implemented and what impact did it have on urban environments. To put it in other words, did it work or not? And just for your information, Sari Gamps is a fictional character from a novel by Dickens. And she is the epitome of the bad midwife. She's an alcoholic, she's depraved, she's dirty, she's ignorant, she's a nightmare. So a Sari Gamp became like the phrase, to qualify these assistants. Now, what's interesting is that and this is where I will explain the first part of this quotation, the midwife's question is not parallel. What is it not parallel to? To this, and this is my last slide. So, in 1934, a group of African herbalists who were seeking recognition from the colonial authorities to practice legally and with some kind of both protection and recognition, wrote saying, you have a list of qualified midwives, but you also have a list of unqualified midwives. Can't you do the same for us and just enlist us on a list of traditional herbalists? So they were using the precedent of the so-called list of unqualified midwives to say, you could do the same with us who are herbalists. And this is what they mean in this quotation that I'm showing now. And this was the answer. The midwife's question is not parallel. So the answer of the medical services was, we are not going to grant you any kind of recognition, especially not on the basis of a list of unqualified midwives, because the list, we established this list only to have a means of prohibiting midwifery and not to authorize unqualified midwifery. Now, my problem is that I never found the list. So you know what happens when you think that a document exists and you don't find it. Various hypotheses. They wanted to make a list, but colonial authorities ended up never doing it. Therefore, there's no way you can find it. Or it did exist, but I was not able to find it, but it is, lying somewhere, and maybe someone or me will find it someday. Or there was a list and it had disappeared, because that's also what happens with archives, as we all know. What we work on is only, the relics of much bigger groups of documents. So anyway, I could use all this, and what will I do if I write this article? What else? Well, of course, I'll go to have more oral interviews. This is, I guess, the first thing that I will endeavor to do. I suppose it would just consist in doing what I was doing while I was trying to track down qualified midwives. Go to, neighborhoods in Accra or Cape Coast or one of these towns which were shown on the map, and ask people whether they knew of a woman, several women who were birth helpers. I'm not very hopeful in terms of the press, because I think I would have spotted things, but maybe court records. If there were maternal or child mortality involved, if a woman has died while she was being helped, during delivery, there could have been, they could have been sued. I don't know, but it's worth just trying, poking into these records. And the last type of source that I could go deeper into is missionary sources, because that's one thing that I didn't really take into account. And a lot of missionaries were working in rural environments, but some were also grounded in towns such as Accra, Cape Coast, of course, which was the core center of Methodism in the Gold Coast. So I could try that, and quite a few of the missionaries trained their own midwives, who were standing somewhere between the qualified midwives recognized by the government and the birth attendants. So they were tolerated but not fully authorized. What do I know about traditional birth attendants today? That not all of them, and that's interesting, were women. There were also some male helpers who would be herbalists, but they had some competence in childbirth. That a lot of them, even though they got paid after a delivery, did not earn their living from this particular occupation. So again, this asks the question of what is a professional woman. For most of them, it was a sort of side activity, if I put it that way, that most of them were elderly women who had had children themselves before, which is not the case of registered midwives, who were young and very often without children. And that's about it. So as you see, I don't have enough to write a whole paper, but I'm looking for your suggestion, and I'm hoping to maybe discuss the paper for the final conference of this research program in a few years' time. Thank you very much.